Petra found the first one had moved at 11:14 p.m., during the second blackout. She knew it had moved because she'd mopped that gallery 340 times in the past 4 years, and she knew where everything stood the way she knew where the furniture was in her own apartment. The small alabaster figure from the square temple at Tel Asmar, catalog number Me7 on its plinth, third from the left in the ancient Near East collection, had been facing the east wall when the lights went out 8 minutes ago. It was facing her now. She stood in the doorway of Gallery 14 and looked at it, and thought about the maintenance call she'd logged 2 weeks ago about the power fluctuations, which facilities had not yet addressed, and whether a surge could somehow rotate a 40-pound stone figure on its plinth without tipping it. She decided it could not. She also decided she was not going to think too hard about that right now because she had 6 more galleries to mop before 2 a.m. She went back to her cart and moved on to Gallery 15. Dr. Yusuf Aslan had been in the building since 7 that morning and had no reasonable intention of leaving before midnight. The grant application was due Friday. The comparative analysis of votive deposit patterns across 3 early dynastic sites was not going to write itself, and his apartment had the specific quality of emptiness that made concentration impossible after dark. The museum was better. The museum at night was better still, the building settling around him, no foot traffic, the collection in its cases doing what it had always done, which was exist without requiring anything from him. He worked in the study room adjacent to Gallery 14 with his laptop and 3 books and a cup of tea that had gone cold an hour ago. He had always preferred the collection at night. During open hours, the objects were mediated by context, the placards, the lighting designed for visitor comfort, the ambient noise of people moving through with their audio guides and their photographs. The objects became exhibits. They became the version of themselves the museum wanted them to be. At night they were just themselves, older than the building containing them, older than the city outside. The votive figures in their cases with their enormous inlaid eyes had been staring at something specific for 4,000 years, and the museum had given them new things to stare at: climate-controlled air, conservation lighting, the backs of placards explaining their provenance. And he had always had the private sense, one he'd never written down or said aloud, that the objects found this arrangement provisional, that they were waiting for something more appropriate. He had never examined that feeling closely. Tonight it was going to examine itself. When the lights went out the first time, he counted to 6 and they came back. When they went out the second time, he counted to 8 and they came back. When they came back the second time, something was different in the quality of the silence from the gallery. He wasn't sure why he thought that. Silence didn't have qualities. He was tired and the grant application was making him irrational. He put his glasses back on and looked at his screen. Then he got up and went to the doorway of Gallery 14 and looked at the collection. Everything in its place. The votive figures on their plinths, the relief panels on the walls, the great limestone head of a ruler in the center of the room, hands broken off at the wrist centuries ago. Eyes carved deep and filled with the specific patient emptiness of something that had been waiting a very long time. He stood there for a moment. Then the janitor walked in with her cart, and they both startled badly, and she said something in what he thought was Spanish, and he said sorry repeatedly, and they stood on opposite sides of the room breathing. "You work late," she said. Statement, not question. "Grant deadline. You're here every night?" "4 years." She was looking at the votive figures. Something in her face was doing a calculation. "You study these?" "Sumerian archaeology, yes." "The small ones?" She pointed at Me7, the alabaster worshipper, hands clasped, enormous inlaid eyes of lapis lazuli catching the overhead light. "Were they always facing that way?" He looked at Me7. He looked at the east wall. He said, "No." They didn't talk about what it meant, not yet. They stood in Gallery 14 and Petra told him about the second blackout, and what she'd seen when the lights returned, and Yusuf listened with the stillness of someone whose professional training had just collided violently with something his professional training had no category for. "The power fluctuations," he said. "How long has this been happening?" 2 weeks, maybe 3. Always at night, always short. She looked at the maintenance request on her phone. "I logged it. Nobody came." "And before tonight, did anything ever seem?" "No, flat, certain. I would have noticed." He believed her. 4 years of mopping these floors in the dark had given her relationship with this collection that he, with his degrees and his publications, did not have. She knew these objects the way you know the people you live with, not their history or their meaning but their presence, the specific weight of them in a room. "What are they?" she asked. He told her. Not the placard version, the real version, the one he'd spent 15 years assembling from temple records and excavation reports and texts that most people never read because they required 3 languages to access. The votive figures were commissioned by worshippers, wealthy ones mostly, the kind who could afford alabaster and lapis lazuli, and the craftsmen who knew how to work them. They were placed in temples as proxies, stand-ins. The worshipper couldn't be in the god's presence at all times, but the figure could. The figure stood in the innermost sanctuary and prayed continuously on behalf of the person who made it. "They were built to do one thing," he said, "forever, without rest, without distraction." He told her about the eyes, why they were built that way, oversized, inlaid with precious materials, the whites of shell and the irises of lapis lazuli. It wasn't aesthetic, it was functional. The eyes needed to be capable of seeing the divine more clearly than human eyes could manage, to maintain vigilance in a presence that would have been overwhelming to an actual human being. "The worshipper went home," he said, "slept, ate, lived their life. The figure stayed, the figure watched." "For 4,000 years, Petra said. "Give or take." She looked at me 7. At the lapis eyes catching the overhead light, and holding it in a way that glass would not have. Something in the quality of that held light bothered her more than she wanted to say. "They were built to watch something," he said. "And if the something watches back," she said. She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. The third blackout lasted 22 seconds. They counted together, standing in the center of Gallery 14, backs against each other, facing outward. Petra had her phone's flashlight on, but the beam was small and the gallery was large and the darkness at its edges was complete. 22 seconds is not a long time. It is a very long time in the dark with things that move. When the lights came back, Petra turned in a slow circle and counted plinths, and her count was right but her geography was wrong. Me7 had not moved this time. Me7 was exactly as they'd left it. The others had moved. Not far, inches maybe, but the alabaster figures that had stood in precise museum arrangement, evenly spaced, carefully angled for visitor viewing, now formed something that was almost a cluster. 3 of them oriented toward the center of the room. 2 more turned slightly inward. The orientation had a quality she didn't have a word for, so she used the word she had. "They're looking at something," she said. Yusuf was looking at the center of the room, at the empty space the figures were oriented toward. "They were always looking at something," he said quietly. "They were built to look at it. We just moved them into a museum and assumed they'd forgotten what they were for." His voice was steady. She noted that, whatever was happening to him internally, he was keeping it managed. She respected that. She was doing the same thing. "The 4th blackout," she said. "We should be somewhere defensible." "Defensible?" He looked at her. "You think they'll?" "I think we should be somewhere defensible." He nodded. "The study room has 1 door." They made it to the study room between the 4th and 5th blackouts, and Yusuf pulled his work off the table to make space and Petra set her cart against the wall. 1 door, no windows. A single overhead light that had its own circuit, Petra noted, separate from the gallery lighting. She knew the building's electrical map the way she knew everything else about it. The fourth blackout hit at 11:58 p.m. and lasted 31 seconds. When it ended, they could see under the study room door that the gallery lights had come back on. Neither of them opened the door for 2 full minutes. In those 2 minutes, Petra stood with her back against the wall beside the door and breathed, and Yusuf sat at the table with his hands flat on its surface, and neither of them spoke. There wasn't anything to say that would have helped. She noticed that about him in the last hour. He didn't fill silence with noise the way some people did when they were frightened. He let the silence be what it was. She respected that. She did the same thing. She thought about the maintenance request. 2 weeks of logged fluctuations and nobody came. She thought about what that meant, whether it was negligence or whether someone further up the chain had looked at the report and made a decision she hadn't been told about, whether this had happened before, whether the bolted plinths were a conservation measure, as she'd always assumed, or something else entirely. She thought about the woman who'd had me 7 commissioned 4,000 years ago, whether she'd gone home that night and slept, whether she'd felt the figure watching on her behalf from the innermost sanctuary and found it comforting, whether she'd understood what she was actually paying for. When Petra finally did open the door, she opened it 6 inches and looked through. The gallery from this angle showed her 3 plinths and 2 figures. One of the figures was closer than it should have been, still on its plinth. The museum had bolted the bases to the plinths after an incident years back. She remembered the maintenance work, but the plinth itself had moved, dragged. There were marks on the floor. She closed the door. "They're in the gallery," she said. "How close?" "Close enough." Yusuf had his laptop open. She hadn't asked what he was doing, but she could see he'd been reading, pulling something up during the minutes they'd sat waiting. Old texts. She could see the formatting of translated cuneiform on his screen. "Tell me something useful," she said. "I'm trying." He scrolled. The votive figures weren't just proxies. There's a secondary function in some of the temple records. When a god was roused, when something disturbed the divine sleep, the votives were the first response. Awaken to assess the disturbance. "Assess," she said. The word used is closer to investigate or locate. She looked at the door, thought about the figure on its dragged plinth, oriented toward the study room. "They know we're here," she said. "They've known since the second blackout." He closed the laptop. "They've been locating us." The 5th blackout lasted 44 seconds and the study room door held, and when the light returned they heard something from Gallery 14 that was not the building settling. A slow grinding, stone on marble floor. Deliberate. Moving. Petra had the door barricaded now, her cart and Yusuf's chair wedged under the handle. It would not stop anything that could drag its own plinth across a gallery floor. They both knew that. "The circuit box," she said. "If I can get to it and isolate the gallery lighting, run it on backup power, keep it continuous." "Where is it?" "Service corridor. Behind Gallery 12. That's through the gallery." "Yes." He looked at her. She looked at him. They'd known each other for 40 minutes, and she had already formed the opinion that he was someone who, under different circumstances, she would have found worth knowing. "There's a service door," she said. "Connects the study room to the corridor behind the galleries. Doesn't go through Gallery 14. You were going to mention this." "I'm mentioning it now." The service door was a fire access panel in the back wall, half hidden behind a shelving unit of reference volumes. She'd used it twice in 4 years. Once to retrieve a mop head she'd left in the corridor, once to let a delivery in through the wrong entrance. She'd never been more grateful for institutional knowledge in her life. They moved the shelf together, quietly. The grinding from Gallery 14 had stopped, which was worse than if it had continued. The service corridor was narrow and unlit except for the emergency strips along the floor. Red light, just enough to see by. Petra led and Yusuf followed, and she counted doors. Gallery 15, 14, 13, 12, and found the circuit panel between 13 and 12 and got it open. The blackout hit while her hands were in the panel. Total darkness. The emergency strips went out too, complete. She did not move. She stood with her hands in the open circuit panel and breathed and counted. 1, 2, 3. Beside her she heard Yusuf breathing, controlled, deliberate. 4, 5, 6. From somewhere in the gallery 14, she thought, but the acoustics of the corridor made direction impossible. A sound, not grinding this time, something lower. Slower, the sound of weight redistributing, of something finding its feet after a very long time of not having used them. 7, 8, 9. Something in the corridor with them. She could not see it. She could feel the displacement of air, the specific quality of a space that had been empty and was no longer empty, and the air pressure adjusting to account for something large that had not been there before. Yusuf's hand found her arm. He didn't grip, just contact. She understood what it meant. He felt it too. 10, 11, 12. She found the backup circuit by feel. She looked at it before the lights went out. She knew which breaker. She counted switches from the left with her fingertips. 13, 14. The thing in the corridor was close enough that she could hear it. Not footsteps, not breathing, just the slow, continuous sound of something ancient moving through a space built for humans, finding its way by means she couldn't name, oriented toward them with the terrible patience of something that had been waiting in stillness for 4,000 years and now had nowhere to be except here. 15. She threw the switch. The gallery lights came on at full brightness and stayed on. She didn't look at what was in the corridor. She looked at the switch. She looked at the panel. She verified the backup circuit was running independently of the main grid. She closed the panel. Then she looked. The corridor was empty. Not empty the way a room is empty when nothing was ever there. Empty the way a room is empty when something has just left it. The air still moving, the emergency strips still swinging faintly on their mounts, the quality of the space still adjusting to an absence that had just become an absence. Yusuf was looking at the service door to Gallery 14. It was ajar. They hadn't opened it. She pushed it the rest of the way and they looked into Gallery 14. The votive figures were on their plinths, all of them. The plinth marks on the floor showed where they'd moved to and back from. Mi-7 was in its original position, facing east, hands clasped, lapis eyes forward. The center of the room was empty. The great limestone head, the ruler with the broken wrists, and the deep carved eyes, was on the floor, not fallen, lowered, set down with a precision that falling could not have produced, flat on the marble, face up, staring at the ceiling. They stood in the doorway for a long time. It worked, Yusuf said finally. It worked, she agreed. Neither of them went into the gallery. They went back to the study room. Petra reset the barricade out of habit. Yusuf sat at the table and opened his laptop and looked at the screen for a long time without doing anything. At some point she asked him what the locators were locating for, what came after the assessment. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. Then he said, "The records use a word. The translation is approximate. The closest equivalent in English is something like the summoned presence, the thing that the votive figures existed to witness. And when it's located, the records stop being useful at that point." He closed the laptop. The priests who wrote them presumably didn't survive long enough to document the next step. She thought about that. The light stopped it, she said, or interrupted it. Or satisfied some condition we don't understand. He took his glasses off and set them on the table. The figures went back to their positions. That might mean the assessment is complete, or it might mean they're waiting for the next blackout. The backup circuit will hold. Yes. And if the power company fixes the grid tonight, then we're fine. He put his glasses back on. Probably. She didn't ask him to clarify probably. Some words did more work left alone. They waited in the study room until the building's regular security arrived at 6 a.m. Petra filed the incident report with the language she'd been composing in her head since 2 in the morning: power fluctuation, possible structural movement of unsecured exhibits, recommend immediate engineering assessment. Yusuf said nothing to the security officer that contradicted her account. In the parking lot after, in the early gray light, he said, "The grant application. Did you finish it?" "No." "Will you?" He looked back at the building, at the facade, at the banners advertising the ancient Near East collection, a photograph of a votive figure's face blown up 6 feet high, those enormous inlaid eyes staring out at the street. "Yes," he said, "probably." She nodded. She had her keys in her hand. She had not slept and would not sleep well when she did, and she already knew that the particular quality of the corridor's darkness, the air displacement, the sound of ancient weight finding ancient purpose, was something she was going to carry with her in a way she hadn't chosen and couldn't put down. "The circuit," he said, "keeping the light continuous. How did you know that would?" "I didn't." She unlocked her car. "It was the only thing I could do." He stood in the parking lot and watched her go. Then he looked at the building again, at the banners, at the eyes. He thought about what the text said, that the votives were the first response, the assessors, the locators. He thought about what they'd been locating for. He got in his car and drove and did not look in the mirror at the building getting smaller behind him. He already knew it wasn't getting smaller. That was just perspective, a trick of distance. The building was exactly the same size it had always been.
If you enjoyed this video, please do not forget to like, comment, or share this video with your friends. Subscribe to our channel to hear more stories like this one.